Okay, welcome back from a Blanket Fort recording studio in a one-bedroom apartment in North Hollywood. This is People Pleaser. I'm Austin Archer, and we got a lot to talk about today. I'm wearing a cow shirt. Today I want to talk about accountability for protest voters. As you may have noticed, the world is kind of a shitstorm right now. Everything's on fire. It's terrible. It's sort of hard to list the myriad ways that the world has been reshaped into a dystopian hellscape nightmare over the last 2 weeks. It has been 2 weeks of the second Trump administration, and it's been two of the most terrifying, upsetting, depressing weeks I can recall in my life being a sociopolitical commentator and advocate. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this. I knew it was going to be bad. Man, I was fighting with everything I had to prevent this from happening because I knew it was going to be bad. I guess maybe I didn't think it would get so bad so fast. Maybe I just thought it would take him a little more time to get some of the things that he wanted to do done. But the amount of chaos and just like horrid dog shit he's been able to unleash in 2 weeks' time is honestly kind of impressive, if I'm being completely honest. It's hard to list all of the ways that the world has been reshaped in the last 2 weeks. You know, there's this slew of air traffic accidents that could seem like a total coincidence, but they're not. They can be directly linked to policies from the second Trump administration that have to do with cutting back on personnel at airports and cutting back on safety personnel and the people whose direct job it is to make sure aircraft are safe to travel and safe to fly. So we got planes like catching on fire, and we got planes crashing into each other, and we got people dying, like more air traffic deaths and accidents in the first 2 weeks than the last 10 years, it feels like. And that's directly because of policies from the new president. Although he says it's because of DEI, which is another fun thing, is just anything that's a problem in the country right now, it's because of DEI. But you don't need to worry about it because they've gotten rid of all DEI initiatives in the corporate world, so that there won't be any of those pesky, disenfranchised, marginalized people working in companies anymore. We'll only have qualified people working, like whatever the fuck his name is, Hegseth. I don't even know his first. Mike Hegseth? Pete Hegseth? I don't give a shit. He's a white supremacist, former news host, alcoholic with barely any military experience whatsoever, and he was just named Secretary of Defense because, you know, this current administration, they're all about merit. They're all about people with qualifications. They're all about people who earn their job. That's why we have a health czar who has brain worms and has no medical experience whatsoever, who thinks that black people have a fundamentally different immune system from white people, although he says blacks. God, he went blacks. I read a study where blacks... You know what? I don't give a shit. I'm doing the voice. I've been back and forth on this as like a progressive person, as an enlightened person, of like whether or not it's ableist or like okay to... It's sort of like how you don't want to dig into, you know, attacks about appearance. You don't want to reinforce beauty norms or beauty standards by saying Donald Trump is bad because he's ugly, because he's conventionally unattractive. But I also think that there's like a threshold where when you become a big enough piece of shit, you lose your access to those basic levels of like social decorum, where it's like, hey, I'm not gonna go into making fun of your disability because that's too low. I'm just gonna stick on to like the things that you've said in your policies, or I'm not gonna make fun of your personal appearance because I don't need to. I can just talk about your opinions and make fun of those. But it's sort of like I say in my song, misogynist, incel, bald. I say it's okay to be bald, as long as you are not a misogynist or incel. But if you're either of those things, then fuck you, you bald piece of shit. And that's what I kind of think, is like, it's totally okay to have a disability where your voice has a tremor in it. There's nothing wrong with that. That's totally fine. But if you're a guy who caused a measles outbreak in Polynesia because you don't believe in vaccine science, and you're trying to go against the majority of leading medical scientists across the world and lead the American health protocol, then fuck you, you fucking warbly voiced psychopath. There was a study that came out from Poland that said that blacks have a different constitution than white people. Fuck you, dude. Blacks? Get the fuck out of here with this DEI blacks bullshit. Y'all are just y'all are one step away from just dropping the hard R, and I just wish you fucking would. Just go full on Elon, unambiguous Zig Heil salute on the stage, and just fucking say it, motherfuckers. I'm really worked up, and I haven't even gotten into like all the shit that they've done. I've listed like 3 things. We're still talking about, we haven't even talked about like the plummeting stock market. We haven't talked about the booming prices, how prices for everything is out of control. Your prescription medication just went up exponentially. Your groceries just went up. How's that doing, everybody? Everybody that wanted the cheaper eggs, are you stoked about that now? How's that going? Are you excited about the depleted labor force? Seeing videos of empty farms with no one to work on them, with houses that need to have remodels done, with no workers there to work on them because we are rounding up migrant workers and throwing them in vans and separating families. Have you seen these videos of children who are going into immigration court by themselves without their parents who don't speak English, and the judge who has this look on his face like, I can't fucking believe this is my life. I can't believe this is what it's come to. I can't believe that this is what I have to do, is I have to look at a little 6-year-old child and be like, do you understand what's happening? Do you understand what deportation means? Are your parents here? They aren't. Do you speak English? You don't. Do you have a lawyer? You don't know what a lawyer is. Do you know what deportation is? Have you ever been to Mexico before? Jesus Christ, government mandated indoctrination in schools. He put out this fucking executive order called like the End Indoctrination in Schools Act. And it's literally Orwellian doublespeak, because the act, if it were accurately named, should just be called the Indoctrination in Schools K through 12 Act. You read this motherfucker, it is the saddest, most disgusting piece of legislation I've ever read. The world is a very bleak place right now. I'm really starting this thing off in a bleak spot. We've been pulled out of the WHO at the beginning of a burgeoning bird flu pandemic. That's not good. Many worldwide virologists and epidemiologists and experts in epidemiology have said that the United States is probably going to be the epicenter of outbreaks and deaths when this pandemic starts to rage, and we have been cut off from the global medical community to get vital life-saving information by our government. That's terrifying. We have rampant attacks on queer identity and dignity right now. We have the government mandating science denial, saying that it's mandated in legislation now that science journals cannot talk about gender identity, that they cannot talk about the reality of trans people existing, that they have to talk about gender and sex in a way that it denies biological reality, the biological reality that there are more than 2 orientations that human beings show up in. There are more than 2 chromosomal orientations, more than 2 anatomical orientations, more than 2 identity orientations that people show up in. And this is just a fact. This is a fact that is plainly observable to anyone who has been alive in the world for any amount of time. And we now have a government that's saying it's mandating that we have to deny those facts. We have Elon trying to put the Federal Reserve, on the blockchain and convert everything into crypto. I mean, I know that people have been talking for a long time about getting rid of physical currency and switching over to a fully digitized form of currency. I understand that it seems like that's the logical progression of where things would go with our current tech, but there's a big difference between switching over to digital currency and switching everything over to crypto. Until crypto can prove that it is not this insanely volatile, completely unpredictable system, it cannot be used as our national currency. It cannot be used as an international currency that is the basis of the Federal Reserve. That's a fucking insane idea. Anybody with a portfolio that's worth anything should be terrified about that. This terrible White House press secretary that's probably going to get fired any week now, and we'll probably have 5 or 6 of these before this administration is over, if it's over. They're currently trying to rewrite the Constitution. This White House press secretary has said that the Constitution is unconstitutional. People people are calling this a coup, accurately calling this a coup, and saying that this administration is actively trying to undo the fibers of this government, to undo the binding foundational fibers of what makes the American government the American government. Why would they be doing that, you ask? Because they want to instill a new government entirely. They want to instill a dictator that does not have to abide by term limits. They want to instill mechanisms for writing and passing legislation that do not need to follow the mechanisms of years past. They want to actually be able to get the things done that they want to get done without having to deal with things like the filibuster or dealing with things like opposition from the opposition party. They want to be able to rule with a totalitarian iron fist. This is not hyperbole. This is what is actively happening. Okay, why the fuck am I being so bleak? Why am I being so angry? Why am I talking about all this dark stuff to start the show? How'd we get here? Well, that's why I want to talk about accountability for protest voters, because obviously, besides the brainwashed Trump cult, what happened? How the hell did we wind up electing Donald Trump for a second administration, for a second term? How did this happen? How did we so roundly defeat him in 2020? We just decimated him with our voting numbers, 81 million people, to just roundly repudiate Trumpism and fire him with this emboldened, emphatic voice. How did we turn that around and only get 75 million people out to vote for his opposition in 2024? How did that happen? The first biggest group of people who are to blame are the Trump cult, are the Trump faithful. Those people are not the people that I'm going to be talking to on this episode. Those people don't watch my podcast. They don't watch my YouTube channel. If they do, hi, hello, you guys are the worst. But who I'm talking to today are all of the leftists that I spent a lot of my energy on during the election cycle. My last episode of the podcast, I talked about the mechanisms of power that Donald Trump and Elon Musk wield to carry out their fascistic and authoritarian designs. The episode before that, I talked about how everyday people allow these things to happen and kind of the banality of evil. On today's episode, I want to get back to something that I haven't talked about in a bit, which is these protest voters, these third-party voters, these abstention voters continue to dig their heels in and refuse to accept any accountability, any responsibility whatsoever for the situation we're currently in. They continue to show up in my comments insisting that they were correct to do what they did and that I was wrong to ever try to dissuade them from their path, that I always had the morally indefensible position, that their position was always the more defensible position, and that I was wrong. I want to talk about the fact that this is obviously a top-down issue. The current situation that we're facing is the elite versus the proletariat. It's the ruling class, the top 1%, an oligarchy of billionaires versus the rest of us. So a lot of people, when I do stuff like this, when I'm really critical of far left protest voters, they say, you're putting your attention and your energy in the wrong place, Austin. You're punching left when you need to be punching up. You're hitting your compatriots when you need to be focusing your attention on criticizing and attacking the ruling class. I understand that. I understand that we need to be unified. We need to be a unified leftist coalition in order to be able to fight this onslaught of far-right extremism and authoritarianism and fascism. I understand that. The problem is, in order for us to be on the same page, in order for us to work together and fight what is happening, we've got to settle some of this shit. We've got to have a little come to Jesus. We've got to get on the same page that your strategy in the 2024 election was a losing one, and that it is a big part of the reason why we are where we are now. We can't work together as a unified coalition if we can't get on the same page about that. If we cannot be on the same page about the fact that you guys shit the bed in 2024, we're not going to be able to work effectively going forward into the 2026 midterms, into the 2028 election. Protest voters may have some ideas that are valid and some beliefs that are rooted in a humanity that is understandable and a morality that has real validity and weight to it. But the fact of the matter is they cost us the election in 2024 and they continue to dodge accountability for that. And we will not be able to move forward as an effective unified coalition until they own what they did, until they own that mistake and they take accountability for it. And that's what I'm going to hope to accomplish in this video. I'm going to hope to convince some of you, hopefully, to start considering the possibility that maybe you were a little misguided. I've been really high on Nick Powers lately. I've been really into his channel. I think he does a really good job of bringing receipts and showing how things, how people will say one thing, but they clearly haven't actually looked up what the reality of like how Democrats versus Republicans vote. I think he does a really, really good job of dispelling a lot of myths and bad arguments from leftists and protest voters. But he made a video recently about where Kamala Harris actually stood on the genocide in Gaza that I thought was fantastic. And I want to start off by just playing that video and listening to what Nick has to say.
Harris was never pro-genocide, and you bought into the propaganda. I have to make so many videos about this because this argument always comes up and it's completely false. So I'm pinning this one. Let's start here at an article written just after the invasion of the Gaza Strip. This article was written on the 14th of December in 2023, showing that Kamala Harris was one of the first politicians to stand out against Israel. And she was pushing against Biden to be more sympathetic towards the Palestinian people. And that was before she was even running for president. And she still continued. July 26th of 2024, I will not be silent on Gaza suffering. She has constantly voiced against Israel's actions. If you don't want to believe that, that's because you're listening to mainstream media instead of Harris. But Nick, Biden is the de facto leader of the Democratic Party and he's pro-Israel. Do you agree with your boss? Do you think Starbucks workers agree with their CEO about union busting? Do you think that people who work for tech companies agree with planned obsolescence? And also, Biden dropped out of the race. He wasn't even running anymore. We got left with Harris, the only pro-Palestinian candidate. But Nick, she said her policies wouldn't differ from Biden's. No, she didn't. You saw a cut clip. This is the clip that you saw.
No change in policy in terms of arms and so forth. No.
And I've had the full interview in my bio this entire time. And I've shown many times that not only was this a negative question, which if you're new to the English language, a negative question is one that's worded in such a way that it requires a no response for an affirmative answer and a yes response for a negative answer. For example, the question, are you not going to the movie? If you were going to the movie, you wouldn't answer yes to that, because if you answered yes, that means you're not going to the movie. You have to answer no. So the question, but no change in policy in terms of arms and so forth, and her answer no, that does not mean that there will be no change in policy. That's not how English works. But also,
I want to say really quick that this blew my mind. I didn't even know about this. So I was very vocal, just like Nick was, about the fact that of the two options on the table, Trump or Harris, Harris was the only viable candidate with an actual shot of winning the presidency who had ever said anything even remotely pro-Palestinian. I said this again and again and again, that there are so many different examples of Harris calling for a ceasefire, of Harris calling for the dignity and ability to self-determination for the Palestinian people, that we need to fight for a two-state solution that really works for the dignity and self-determination and preservation and safety of the Palestinian people, while also preserving Israel's right to defend itself. That she was the only candidate who was offering any kind of rhetoric like this again and again and again during the election. Leftists would say things like, if she could just say one thing, if she could just say one thing that even indicated at all that she cares about Palestinians, I would consider voting for her. And I would give them a slew of different quotes, a slew of different videos of her being completely unambiguous about her support for Palestine, completely unambiguous about knowing that what is happening in Gaza is not okay, that it is a humanitarian crisis, and that she intends to push back against it and to fight it and to stand up for Palestinians. And again and again and again, those people would show up in my comments and say, yeah, but she said her policies wouldn't change from Biden's. You're such a clown, Austin. You clown. She said that her policy wouldn't even change from Biden's. And I didn't even know that she never fucking said that. I would be like, okay, cool. Well, you have one interview where she said that. I've got all these other interviews where she seemed to suggest otherwise. Of the two options, Trump or Harris, she's the only one that has provided any kind of hope whatsoever regarding the situation in Gaza. She's your only viable option if you actually care about helping the people in that region. But here's Nick showing me that actually she never even fucking said that thing that they were saying she said. They were just misunderstanding her answer to the question and taking a video clip out of context.
But also it was cut off there. She realized that it was confusing, so she switched it up and said, we have to get a deal done. When you look at the significance of this to the families, to the people who are living in that region, a deal is not only the right thing to do to end this war, but it will unlock so much of what must happen next. If you paid attention to what she said, then you know that she is against what Israel was doing. But Nick, Biden sent so much to Israel. Again, that was Biden. Biden was not running for president. Biden dropped out. Please again refer to the Biden part earlier. But Nick, Democrats sent so many weapons over to Israel, only non-offensive weapons. You can disagree with that decision if you want to, but the fact is Democrats only voted for bills that sent defensive weapons to Israel, weapons that they could not use on the Gaza Strip or in Palestine. When you look at the bills that have offensive weapons going to Israel, you find out that Republicans voted for those bills and Democrats voted against them. You look at some of the bills like this that are bipartisan, and you see that both parties are voting for them. Go and read the bill, because when you do, it's always going to be defensive articles. And when you
So this is another thing that I want more people to understand, because I did not understand this. This is another thing that while the election was going on, people would show up in my comments and go, hey, I just can't support the Democrats who are actively sending bombs that are being used to kill kids in Gaza. And my kind of response at the time was to say, this situation is terrible. I've never been ambivalent about calling the situation in Gaza a genocide, calling it a humanitarian crisis. I have never been hemming and hawing or, kind of both sidesing the issue. I have always been definitively and very clear that I do not support what Israel is doing in Gaza, that I see it as a full-blown genocide, a full-blown humanitarian crisis of the most drastic order, and that I see the United States' support of Israel as deeply, deeply morally and ethically problematic, and that I do not support that. But my rejoinder to it was always like, I don't get to sign off personally on how every single cent of my tax dollars are spent. My tax dollars, your tax dollars, our tax dollars are spent in all kinds of ways that we don't agree on. That's just part of the burden of being a taxpayer, is like you have to, it's just a fine that you have to pay in order to live in this place, in order to have a functioning government, and then they take that money and they spend it on things that they all agree to spend it on. And sometimes you agree with those things, and sometimes you really, really fucking don't. But I would sort of respond like, of the two options, of the two establishment powers, the only option that even ever expresses any sympathy or humanity toward the Palestinian people is the Democratic Party. And if you want to have the ability to fight with either of these parties about whether or not you want them sending money for weapons for Israel to attack Gaza, which one would you rather fight with? Would you rather fight with the Democrats, or would you rather fight with the Republicans? Would you rather push a Democratic president on the funding that they're offering to Israel, or would you rather push a Republican president? And while I think these are all very valid arguments and very valid things to bring up in response to this, what Nick is saying is actually 10 times better, because Nick is simply highlighting the actual difference between offensive and defensive weaponry. And I just don't think enough people understand that. Again, I didn't even understand this. Defensive weapons contributing to Israel's Iron Dome. These are simply weapons that prevent Israel from being bombed by outside agitators. So if Iran, say, wanted to bomb Israel, what the U.S. is supplying them with, the weapons that the U.S. is supplying them with, and the weapons that the Democrats are voting to supply them with, this is like when you actually look at the voting record, Democrats support supplying Israel with defensive weaponry, just like Harris says she supports Israel's right to defend itself, not Israel's right to attack and subjugate other nations, not Israel's right to carry out a genocide, not Israel's right to live in an active apartheid state, but Israel's right to defend itself from outside threats. That's what the Democratic Party supports, is defensive weaponry. An offensive weapon is like a cruise missile that Israel can send into a neighborhood in Gaza. It's tanks and artillery for their ground forces and their ground troops. Those are offensive weapons, weapons that can be used offensively against other parties. Defensive weapons stay in Israel and they're used to defend Israel from outside attacks. And I think I just always thought that was kind of like a splitting hairs distinction, but literally the weapons that Nick is talking about, the weapons that Democrats voted to give to Israel, are weapons that cannot be used offensively. Not like in a legal sense, not like they're not legally allowed to use them offensively in a literal sense. They're literally not capable of using these weapons in an offensive sense. The way that these weapons work is they only work defensively. They can't be used to shoot anything or drop any bombs into neighborhoods in Gaza. Those are offensive weapons. That's what offensive artillery is. So like all of these people who just keep going to the line of like, I can't support the party that is actively giving weapons to bomb children. Well, they weren't, dude.
Read the bill and you find out what defensive articles they are. It's always for the Iron Dome. Because Israel's innocent citizens are in danger of being bombed by Iran. And I'm not telling you that you need to agree that sending defensive articles to Israel is a good idea. I'm saying that you cannot factually say that they were helping the genocide, because that is false. But Nick, Democrats weren't even calling for a ceasefire. Yes, they were, and there are entire websites devoted to this. As of May 8th, 2024, there are 94 members of Congress, and they're all Democrats who called for a ceasefire. Freaking nuts. But Nick, we need to listen to Palestinians and ask them what they want. Why don't you fucking do that? If you did, you'd find out that people did ask people in Gaza what they wanted, and they said that they prefer anyone over Trump. There have been many articles about this, and in all of them, they say that they were okay with Harris getting elected, and they were all terrified of Trump getting elected. I am so tired of this narrative that Kamala Harris lost because of her stance on Gaza. No, she fucking didn't. If you actually gave a flying fuck about Palestinians, then you would have done some of your own research instead of buying into the propaganda that you saw on social media platforms and big media. Because deep down, here is the fucking thing about all of this. Democrats did not lose this because of their strategy. Democrats did not lose this because of what they believe, what Harris said, what Biden said, or what they didn't say or do. He also didn't lose this election because Donald Trump makes good points, because we know for a fact that that's not what happened. Kamala Harris lost this election because Donald Trump got more votes where it mattered than Kamala Harris did. That's why Kamala Harris lost. Kamala Harris lost because people didn't vote for her. And now we have to deal with this. Fucking read it. Read it.
Yeah, I'm also just going to leave that on the screen for a while. I'm just going to have you look at that for the next little bit while I yap about what we just watched. And to the listening audience, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, sorry you can't see this. The video version of the podcast is much better these days. There are a lot of visual aids that really help the thing come to life. I can't suggest enough that you subscribe on YouTube and watch it there, but here we go. So what Nick does there in that video is pretty thorough. He goes through like every single common rejoinder and slogan that you're likely to hear from these leftists, from these protest voters in comments, where they're going to say things like, oh, but Nick, this, and he goes through one by one and gives you the perfect response to it with receipts. Nick's really, really good about bringing receipts, but of course, people just were still in his comments and in mine. I shared this video on Threads, and my comments were instantly filled with these people who just were like, cool, I don't care that he took away all of my other talking points. Allow me to just be the most goalpost movinist motherfucker in the world and just move the goalpost to my next talking point. I talked about this in my last video that I made about Jill Stein voters and third-party voters, about how they're so unserious and about how they use the exact same disingenuous rhetorical tactics that Trump supporters and far-right people use, that they move the goalpost, that they are disingenuous and bad faith with their framing devices around their arguments, and all of this really frustrating stuff. And boy, the goalpost moving after Nick was so incisive about going point for point through all of their regular talking points. They were like, cool, you took away 9 out of 10 of my go-to slogans. I still got the 10th one, baby boy, and I'm still gonna drop the 10th one in the comments. Matt made this, dropped into my comments and said, number 1, according to Track APAC, a group that uses data from OpenSecrets.org and the Federal Election Commission to track Israeli lobbyist groups, Harris has received around $5.4 million from pro-Israel organizations. First of all, I want to look at the wording of this number 1 thing. Pro-Israel organizations. What does that mean? Is that just any organization that has been vocally supportive of the country of Israel? Or is that Israel itself? Is that like Israeli funding? Because pro-Israel organizations, that can be any number of companies that have ties to Israel, which is a lot of companies and donors and people with money. Like, Israel is a very prosperous company that has a lot of like really strong business contacts. As I mentioned earlier, Israel has been allied with the United States for decades. Israel has been allied with one of the strongest military forces and economic forces on the planet for decades. You're not going to run a successful presidential presidential campaign in this country without taking money from people who have ties to Israel. Just like you're probably not going to run a successful presidential campaign in this country without taking money from people who have financial ties to Japan or China or Bangladesh or fucking anywhere else, because in order to win an election in America, you need money. I've said this before. I said it during the presidential election race. I talked about the fact that like Jill Stein not having AIPAC money has nothing to do with Jill Stein being too principled to take money from AIPAC, and everything to do with AIPAC not offering Jill Stein any money. That's all it is, bottom line. Jill Stein is a grifter. She's a liar. She gets to posture as though she doesn't have AIPAC money in her campaign because she's morally and ethically opposed to having AIPAC money in her campaign. Jill Stein's only reason for running for president is to make money. She's a grifter. She's there to collect money and then leave when she knows she's going to inevitably lose. If AIPAC were offering Jill Stein money, you best believe she would be taking their fucking money. She would take as much of their money as she could possibly get. She only didn't have AIPAC money in her campaign because they weren't giving her any money. Also, this comment and this tracker doesn't say how much of that 5.4 million is AIPAC money. It just says donors that have ties to Israel, so that are supportive of Israel. So very nebulous terminology there. Also, $5.4 million might sound like a lot of money, but that's before you actually look at the actual breakdown of like how much money Kamala Harris's campaign raised for the 2024 election. Between January 2023 and October 2024, Harris's campaign raised $997.2 million, just shy of $1 billion, buddy. Just shy of $1 billion. This is $997.2 million raised from a wealth and a diversity of different sources. And 5.4 million of that are sources that are sympathetic toward Israel, that have expressed some kind of sympathy or, allegiance with Israel at some point in their past. You take away $5.4 million from $997 million, and you've still got $992 million, dude. You've still got goddamn near $1 billion, dude. So, like, this is a pretty weak argument when you actually consider that, like, 98% of her campaign funding was not tied to Israel or Israel sympathetic funding. It's just like when you're running a presidential campaign in America and you want it to be successful, you raise as much fucking money as you possibly can. Let's go back into this comment. This guy then says, 2, add up all the protest votes and give them to Harris. Trump still wins. This is something that you see a lot in these comments. These leftist voters that refuse to take accountability, that refuse to admit that they were wrong, that refuse to admit that they are responsible for where we are right now, they love to say this. They love to go, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter that I cast a protest vote, that I voted for Claudia, or that I voted for Jill Stein, or that I voted for Cornel West. It doesn't even matter. You add up all those votes and she still loses. Okay, let's add up all the votes then. So all of the third party or independent nominees that got votes in the 2024 presidential nomination, it was Jill Stein, RFK, Chase Oliver, Claudia De La Cruz, Cornel West, and Peter Sonsky, whoever the fuck that is. They got about 3 million votes. So how many votes did Kamala Harris lose by in the popular vote? Well, the final tally was Donald Trump at 77,302,580 votes and Kamala Harris at 75,017,613 votes, which you will recognize as fewer than 3 million. So the actual margin in the popular vote was less than 3 million, and independent voters got 3 million votes. Kamala Harris got 48.3% of the popular vote. Donald Trump got 49.8% of the popular vote. Third party and independent candidates got about 2.13% of the vote. So even on its face, this comment, when you see it, is wrong. Like, there's no way to actually be sure how many of those 3 million votes or those 2.13% would have gone to Harris if they hadn't gone independent. But like, those numbers potentially, hypothetically, could make up the gap in at least the popular vote. But here's the major thing that people who make this argument are missing. And I can't tell if they're missing it because they're just being stupid or if they're actually lying and just being disingenuous and bad faith. The major thing they're missing is that in those the final tally of protest votes, you need to count absentee votes. You need to count the abstention vote. That matters in the tally because maybe 3 million people turned up and filled out a ballot for Cornel West or Jill Stein or Claudia de la Cruz, but there were about 5 to 6 million people who voted in the 2020 election who didn't vote in 2024. And those votes matter because those are the votes that did go to Joe Biden in 2020 and that disappeared for Kamala Harris in 2024. You have to add those into the total if you're going to do an honest recounting of what actually happened. 3, this person posts a quote from Emma Goldman that says, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. The establishment will never allow us to vote away their power. You know, you're like half right here. The establishment will never allow you to fully vote away their power. That's not how voting works. They're not going to let you vote them out of, vote the government out of existence. The establishment, as in the Democrats or Republicans, are always going to be in control of the governmental mechanism that rules over the United States. Those establishment powers are going to be very hard to unseat and very hard to get rid of with a simple vote. But you still have the ability as a voter in America to determine which characteristics of that establishment you are putting in the driver's seat. The establishment is not a monolith. They don't think in a monolithic way. It's not just a omni-personality with an omnipresent set of goals where they all agree on it, like this is what we want to do as the establishment. These are our policies. There are decidedly different policies between Democratic leaders and Republican leaders. If you want more examples and receipts of those, again, check out that Nick Powers guy. He has so many videos displaying the receipts of the evidence of the difference between what Democrats vote for versus what Republicans vote for, and what the differences are between the values of these two parties. They may both be two faces of the establishment powers that run this country, but you as a voter still get to decide between which one of them is in charge. And if you can't see a meaningful distinction between what is happening right now under the second Trump administration and what Democrats regularly and routinely advocate for in their legislation, then I don't know, like maybe you shouldn't be participating in politics because you're not seeing the board clearly. And finally, 4, this person writes, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. I talked about how they use the same disingenuous, bad faith, rhetorical, argumentative devices that Trump supporters use, and this is one of those. It's just like slogans. They fucking love slogans, man. You protest voters, you leftists, you third-party voters, you're so stubborn, and you love a good slogan. You love, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. Scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. Meanwhile, we are sitting with a literal fascist government in the White House as a direct result of your actions, as a direct result of your protest. That's where we actually are. In actual reality, if you want to join us here, please, I know I'm mad, I know I'm mean, I know I'm smug, I know I'm annoying, but I'm actually begging with you and pleading with you in this episode of my show to please join us here in reality, because where we actually are is real life fascists. Real Nazis are doing real fascism, real Nazi shit, trying to unspool the fabric of the American identity and the American government right now in the White House, and that is a direct result of what you chose to do in the election in 2024. We could have been electing the first black woman to ever be president in this country's history on January 20th, and instead we got Elon doing a Sig Heil salute on the inaugural stage behind the presidential pulpit. We had those two different realities that we could choose between, and you chose the other one. Whether you want to admit that or not, that's what we're here to get to the bottom of, is you need to figure out a way to be willing to admit that, to be willing to own that. When you say scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds, I have such a hard time taking you seriously because I'm dealing with real fascists right now because of you. Had another person write, this is such a bad take, dude. You don't think there's any merit to criticism of the reality of her not being pro-genocide, but very much shutting out even Palestinian American Democrats from having a Voice during her short campaign and convention where they spewed Israeli government manufactured propaganda? Also, the protest votes would have changed nothing for her results. So we already addressed that last part. There's no telling whether or not the protest votes would have actually changed things. They probably would have, because we can actually see what it looks like when we show up as a unified coalition. When Biden ran in 2020 and we showed up as a unified coalition, we won in a landslide. So we actually have a reference to say, this is what it looks like when everyone shows up, and you have to count the absentee and abstention votes in the total of protest votes when you're actually trying to do an accurate count. And it's likely that everyone who was going to vote for Donald Trump showed up and voted for him, and everyone who potentially, hypothetically, would have voted for Harris either voted for Jill Stein or Claudia de la Cruz or Cornel West, or didn't vote at all. And that's probably the biggest group, is that fourth group, the people who didn't vote at all. So when you say the protest votes wouldn't have changed the results, you're just incorrect about that, okay? We need to put that to bed. You're incorrect, and if you don't realize you're incorrect, I hope you do now. And if you do know you're incorrect and you're saying it anyway, then you're lying, and stop doing that. But also this take about how, like, she shut out Palestinian voices. I think that there's some validity to be had here. I was disappointed to see that there was no one to advocate for Palestinian life and safety and freedom at the Democratic Convention. I was disappointed to see that they were sort of shut out from that conversation. But also, like, this is also pretty disingenuous and bad faith, the framing here, because pro-Palestinian demonstrators were let into so many of her rallies and speeches. They were allowed to speak, they were allowed to protest, they were allowed to shout her down. She gave them time. Like, her aides would say, we're going to give you guys some time to speak at the beginning of the presentation, and then she's going to speak. They would even do like a talkback where she would let them ask questions and she would go back and forth with them. The clips that you've taken out of context where she goes, I'm speaking now, and if you want Donald Trump as president, that's what you're advocating for, are after she had already let those protesters speak for a considerable length of time. So you've got this out of context clip where she's going, I'm speaking now, and you see that and you start to proliferate that and share that around social media and go, look how disgusting this is. Look how she's shutting down the voices of people who are pleading for their dignity in their life. But what you're not seeing or showing, and I don't know which one it is, and if I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt, I would say you're not seeing it. Like, you're just seeing the out of context clip, is the fact that she let those protesters be there and she let them actually have time and space. So this isn't a very like generous framing here. You're framing it as though she went out of her way to not address the Palestinian plight at all, when in actuality, she herself multiple times at the pulpit of multiple different speeches and rallies in no unclear terms called for the need for a ceasefire, for a two-state solution, for the freedom and safety and self-determination of Palestinian people alongside the ability for Israel to defend itself. But you guys were like, well, if she says anything about Israel whatsoever, then it's null and void. Then, like, I don't give a fuck what she said about the other stuff. Again, goalpost moving. You start with saying we need to hear anything whatsoever from her that suggests that she would be supportive of Palestine. She gives you that, but then she says something that's also sympathetic to Israel, and you go, nope, not good enough. You move the goalpost, you move to another thing. If you can't play in a reasonable, if you can't engage in this work in a reasonable way, if you can't go, okay, you met my terms, now let me meet you halfway, then we're not going to be successful unifying on this. We're not going to be successful coming together and working together to defeat the party that's in power right now that we actually need to defeat. I pointed this out to this person. I was like, why is it a bad take? Like, just because it's not what you want me to say? And this person responded, no, it's a bad take because you're punching down and to the left rather than at the shitty campaign and views from the top. I fucking voted for her, so you're pandering to me, and it still fucking sucks. I see this a lot too. People in comments who are like, I voted for her and I still think it fucking sucks. But also, I really want to talk about this whole you're punching left instead of punching up. I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, that obviously this is a top-down battle. Obviously, we're not going to have a whole lot of success at recruiting the Trump cult to our cause, which means that we are left to our own as a left coalition to figure out how to get unified before midterms in 2026 and before the election in 2028. And if we're going to do that, we need to be able to speak honestly with each other. We need to be able to criticize criticize each other. I think this is such a weak cop-out cope response when I see it in comments, when people say, why are you punching left? And every time I do a video about this, where I talk about what frustrates me with these protest voters and these militant leftists that are so ideologically rigid, people go, why are you punching left instead of punching up? Hey, don't worry. I'm absolutely punching up. I'm absolutely focusing my attention and energy on how terrible the current administration is and how terrible the establishment powers are. That is a lot of my work. Like, I've been doing this work full time for 5 years. There's plenty of content of me punching very forcefully up. But this idea that just because we share a socioeconomic strata, that should exclude you from having to receive any criticism from me whatsoever, that I'm not allowed to criticize you because you have a number in your bank account that might be similar to mine, I think is ridiculous. The fact that because we are in the same socioeconomic sphere, you're not capable of fuck-ups, that you're not capable of making major mistakes that are harmful, that hurt our cause, our collective cause. Just because we're on the same team, we are, and just because we are fighting against the same much bigger problem, doesn't mean you, my teammate, aren't capable of doing great harm to our collective goals. Doesn't mean you aren't capable of fucking up. You are capable of fucking up. I'm capable of fucking up. You did fuck up. And in order for us to move forward in a meaningful, constructive way, you need to be able to own that. I stopped interacting with Austin during the campaign cycle for this. Blaming people that won't abide supporting a G-side is wild. First of all, just want to stop and just say, liar. You're a liar. This is just something that I saw again and again and again during the campaign cycle, and seeing it again, I have to be unequivocally clear about this. This is a lie. Saying that I'm blaming people who wouldn't abide supporting an active genocide. This disingenuous bad faith framing that we got from so many of you, our teammates and our compatriots, where you tried to frame it as though our support for the Harris Walls campaign was the same as our support for the genocide in Gaza. That our support for Harris and Walls was because we did not see the genocide in Gaza as a hardline moral standstill issue, and you did. That was the dividing ideological line between your position and our position, was you refused to support the genocide, and we're totally okay with supporting the genocide. I find this framing so insulting and disgusting, and it's just a fucking lie. And I can't really like take it. There's no way for me to look at it and give the benefit of the doubt, because it's just so blatantly disgusting. No one who was doing the advocacy work that I was doing during the 2024 election was saying you should vote for Harris Walls because genocide is good. Absolutely nobody was saying that. Everybody that I know, everybody that I work with who was advocating for Harris Walls, including me in every single fucking video I ever made about it, had no problem calling the genocide in Gaza what it was, saying it is a genocide, it is a humanitarian crisis, it is terrible. Everyone is correct to be upset about it. You are correct. We are not ideologically divided on this issue. We never have been. I have never been ambivalent about my position on this issue, about how I feel about Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people. Framing it as though we are on two different sides of this issue absolutely drives me nuts. It's a fucking lie, it's disgusting, and it really makes it hard for us to work together. Because here's what's actually true. Is every single person who was advocating for Harris Walls, like I was doing so because in the binary reality of the choice between Harris or Trump, she was the only candidate that offered any kind of hope for the people in Gaza. If you actually care about the safety of those people and the well-being of those people, then the only viable option you were being offered was her. Because now you have this, the thing that Nick was talking about at the end of his video. You have Trump saying that they should all be pushed completely out of the region and be forced to be international refugees, that they should just completely lose their access and their right to the land at all whatsoever. You have Trump trying to help Israel finish their colonialist apartheid ethnic cleansing project. That's what you have now. Those were the two options on the table. You had Harris, who was advocating for a two-state solution and for Palestinian safety and dignity and self-determination, and you had Trump, who was saying he wanted Israel to finish the job. You had Trump, who was Bibi Netanyahu's preferred winner, on the other hand. Those were your two options. And we were advocating for Harris because, like you, we cared about the safety of those people in Gaza. We obviously recognize that the situation is a fucking nightmare and is terrible. It's always been a nightmare. My entire life, it's been a nightmare. It's been happening every single day of your life. It's been happening every single day you watching this video have been alive, and it's always been bad, but it could be made worse by a Trump victory. That's what we were trying to tell you. And you kept saying, like, how can a bad situation get worse? How could it? It's already bad. How could it possibly get worse? And that's ridiculous to just like, you're begging for the bad situation to get worse when you ask questions like that. But also to frame it as though the difference between us is we're totally cool with little kids having their families blown away and little kids being bombed and hospitals being bombed, and you're not cool with that. And that's the difference between us. That's not the difference between us. We have never been on two sides of that debate. We have always been ideologically aligned on that. The difference was our strategy of how to approach that issue. We believed correctly that the only viable option we had was to prevent a Trump administration. You believed incorrectly that you could make some kind of moral gesture by either not voting or voting for a candidate who had no chance of winning, like Claudia de la Cruz or Jill Stein, that would show that you don't morally support genocide. Well, there are no moral victories in war. There's no moral victories in what's actively happening to those people. It doesn't fucking matter to them that you refuse to sign your name to what's happening. Your tax dollars are already over there. You're already a part of the country that supports it. You've been supporting it your entire life. It doesn't fucking matter if you like write on a piece of paper, I am morally opposed to this. You still have to take action. And excusing yourself from the process of taking action, from the reality of the binary choice that was presented to you, is as bad as just saying, covering your eyes, plugging your ears, and going, la, 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 I don't care what happens to them. I'm just going to keep saying that I really don't want it to happen. I'm just going to keep going, I don't like it. I don't like it. Blah, 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 blah. I don't like it. We don't like it. Nobody likes it. And we have to take action. Politicians are supposed to represent our best interests and wishes for the country. A cop backed by Zionist lobbying sure the fuck doesn't represent me any more than the orange shill, and ticking a box that would guarantee more children get bombed would have rested painfully on my heart. Well, I have really bad news for you, because whatever box you did tick or didn't tick, that's what you wound up voting for. That was the result of it. Whether you were an absentee voter or whether you clicked a box for Jill Stein or Claudia de la Cruz, what you actually did was ensured that Donald Trump would become president and that even more people would die in Gaza, and that the situation that was already terrible would be made even worse, and that the situation for the marginalized and repressed communities in the country that you live in would be made worse. Like, you just went and you made everything worse. You were so concerned about this weighing painfully on your heart, weighing on your conscience, that you made a choice that will lead to much, much, much more worse things that you're going to have to deal with in your heart, if you're being honest. This whole cop that was backed by Zionist lobbying. Again, just liar. Not a cop. Was a lawyer. Was an AG, an attorney general, or a district attorney, a DA. Sorry, a prosecutor. Not a cop. Backed by Zionist lobbying. Raised $1 billion, and $5 million of those dollars had ties to Israel. So you're just incorrect here. And whether you're aware that you're incorrect and you're lying, or whether you're unaware that you're incorrect and you're just ignorant, either way, you need to knock it the fuck off. Hard disagree. She was sopping up that AIPAC money like practically every other politician in DC. We already covered this one, right? Like, Jill Stein would have had the AIPAC money if they had offered it to her, but they didn't. So she didn't get the money. Golden Plates wrote, "To be fair, if I lived in a swing state, I'd have walked 24 miles uphill both ways in the snow to vote for Kamala. But I live in the most shit-lib blue state in the most shit-lib blue district, so I voted for Claudia because she aligns with my values, and my vote wasn't going to affect that race or any race in my state or local elections anyways." So this is another thing that I want to talk about is electoral college propaganda, and I don't think enough people know about this, but the propaganda that tells you that unless you live in a swing state, your state is spoken for. This is something that Nick Powers, again, can't recommend Nick's page enough, did a great series on during the election about how a lot of these spoken for states are actually a lot closer than you think. It is electoral college propaganda meant to disenfranchise you as a voter of your power as a voter that tells you that whatever state you're in, if it's a deep red state or a deep blue state, it doesn't, like, it's going blue no matter what, it's going red no matter what, so you can really vote your conscience because it doesn't really matter. This is voter disenfranchisement. A lot of these states are actually in play. Like states like Texas are actually in play if everyone actually shows up. It is in the interest of the Conservative Party to make people think that these states are not in play so that people become apathetic, they don't show up, or they show up and they vote for someone who has no chance of winning. You probably, live in a shit-lib blue state with a bunch of shit libs that voted for shit lib things, and that's why you feel good voting for Claudia, and your state probably did go blue. But if there were, several 100,000 or several million of you that voted the way that you did, this could have affected the popular vote. Now, maybe Harris still loses the electoral vote, but we would at least have a little bit of leverage right now that we could point to and say, hey, this is the third straight presidential election where Donald Trump has lost the popular vote. And we could start to push for initiatives like abolishing the Electoral College, because the Electoral College is just DEI for white conservative states and unpopular white conservative policies. We could push for things like we should actually have federal elections that are won by a popular vote because that just makes logical sense. And we could actually advocate for that if we were winning the popular vote. But if everyone in a shit-lib blue state that was going to be shit-lib blue no matter what they did goes out and either votes independent or doesn't vote at all because it's just going to be a bunch of shit-lib blues doing shit-lib blue things, then we can't show, hey, look, our policies are more popular, our beliefs are more popular, our agenda is more popular. So this is voter disenfranchisement that you're buying into. There is coordinated propaganda to make you believe that your vote doesn't matter if you're not in a swing state. Don't buy into it. Don't believe it, because you still have to be part of a bigger movement. It's bigger than you and your conscience. It's bigger than you and what you think you should do and your values. You need to be part of the collective that is saying our collective goals are more popular en masse than conservative, fascist, authoritarian goals are. Jenny Benny says, I don't even care about their protest votes or whatever. If they would just stop actively attempting to sabotage every left-leaning candidate with a viable chance of being elected, that would be enough. I want to say something, Jenny Benny. I agree with you. My dream ticket for 2028 is Jasmine Crockett and AOC. I don't care who's who. I don't care which one is president and which one's vice president. Jasmine Crockett and AOC is like my dream ticket. It's most likely never going to happen. Most likely, we're not going to get that. They are going to sabotage the most logical or like most enticing far left progressive candidate, and we're not going to get our way. And guess what? I'm still going to vote for them because I have a fucking job to do. So I understand this position. I understand being like, I wish they would stop sabotaging campaigns from people like Bernie. I wish they would stop sabotaging really popular campaigns with people like that one and stop, pushing forward these like more moderate and centrist candidates. I get it. I completely agree with you. We're most likely not going to get that, and we still need to show up and do our job. because elections and voting aren't about getting our perfect candidate. It's not about getting every single one of the items on our wish list. It's about making sure we come together to repudiate far-right extremism. And right now, more than ever, that has to be goal number one. More than getting my perfect candidate into the White House, goal number one has to be a round, emphatic repudiation of what is currently in the White House. I talked about this on the last two episodes of the podcast as well, but there's also like a pretty big reason why the Democratic Party doesn't give you a further left progressive candidate, and why they have policies and agenda points on in their campaigns that appeal to the middle or that appeal to centrists or like, moderate liberals. And it's because they're trying to make a broad platform that appeals to a coalition of about 80 million voters. They have to appeal to everyone. Far left progressive issues aren't as popular or as exciting to most voters as you think they are. There's a reason why most of the far left creators that you follow on the internet have a hard time getting platforms over like 2 million or 3 million people. And that's because there's just not that many of us out there. Most people in the left voting electorate, the voting bloc on the left, the voting coalition, are more moderate. And so the Democrats are forced to create a platform that appeals to the most possible people. They will have agenda items in there and policy propositions that will appeal to far left progressives. Those will be in there, but they will also have things that appeal to the center. And you need to be willing to play team ball and to compromise if you're going to be successful in this two-party system. Husker Don'ts says, sorry you couldn't convince people that the current genocide was okay, but the future genocide would be bad. Again, you're a liar, and fuck you, frankly. That was never my goal. My goal was never to. You can check the receipts. Check any one of my videos that I made during the election cycle. My goal was never to convince you that the current genocide is okay and that the future one will be bad. My message was consistent from just after October in 2023, October 7th, to today. My message was consistent that what was happening, that the response to the attacks on October 7th from Israel were disproportionate, were incredibly inhumane, that it was tantamount to ethnic cleansing and a genocide. My message was that what was happening is bad, but that we still have a job to do and we still have to repudiate Trumpism, that we still have to do our job to make sure far-right authoritarian extremism does not take root and take the executive seat of power in America. My message was never to try to convince you that the genocide was okay. And saying that it was is just a fucking lie. You obviously haven't actually watched any of my videos, and if you have and you're still saying that, you're just a fucking liar. And that's what I mean when I say you're not serious people. Like you're engaging with the same rhetorical, argumentative tactics that Trump supporters do. You're not telling the truth. You're lying to get your agenda out there. You're engaging in bad faith. You're pretending that there is an ideological difference in between the two of us on where we sit with the genocide in Gaza. There isn't. That's a lie. That's not true. Please set that down and understand that we are on the same side of that. Where we disagree is strategy. What next? What can we do as a unified coalition to repudiate extremism in our country? How do we come together to fight the top, to fight the people at the oligarchy, the ruling class? How do we work together to do that? And you think compromising and working with me means admitting that genocide is okay. That's not what it means. We are unified on genocide being bad. I feel like so many of these protest voters and leftists are like, hey, I'll work with you, but you need to work with me. And my terms are that you need to admit that what's happening in Gaza is bad. And what they don't understand is that's not something that I need to admit. I've already admitted it. That's not something that you need to get me to come to. That's not a position that I need to arrive at. I've been there. We've all been there. All of us who voted for Harris Walls have been there with you. You just haven't been listening. Your terms have been met. When you wanted a candidate who spoke out for Palestinian freedom and dignity, you got one. Your terms were met and you didn't listen. When you wanted a candidate who spoke about Palestinian self-determination, you got one. When you wanted the option between two options that would provide a better chance for Palestinian survival and safety and hope, you had one. You had one on the table and you chose poorly. You kept moving the goalposts and you kept rearranging the terms of the agreement, saying, well, no, she can't have any money whatsoever in her campaign that has any ties to Israel. And it's like, okay, well, she has barely any. Like, barely any of her funding is coming from Israel. And you're like, that's too much. That's too much. And it's like, okay, well, like, you have to be willing to negotiate with us here. You have to be willing to approach the conversation in good faith and be honest about where our ideological divide is and not lie about what we're disagreeing on. Linux Robot Geek says, being sympathetic toward Palestinians is meaningless if you don't prosecute those involved. Again, this is a goalpost shift. So you get the sympathy that you're looking for. You get rhetoric that is sympathetic towards Palestinians, but then you're like, doesn't matter. Doesn't mean anything. If you're not going to prosecute the entire Israeli government when you're in the White House, then it's meaningless. You just keep moving the goalpost to something else. You just keep moving it so that it can never be met. And if you're not willing to say, okay, that's good enough, you've done enough to earn my vote, I'm not happy about it, this isn't perfect, I'm not perfectly satisfied, all of my terms have not been perfectly met, but this is enough for me to say, I can stomach doing this over Trump. If you can't do that, then you're not participating in the American electoral system the way it was meant to be participated in, because that's what a two-party system is. You're never going to get all of your terms met. I didn't get all of my terms met. Nobody did. But I voted for her anyway because I had a fucking job to do, and I understood the assignment. Over It Forever writes, I voted for her against my better judgment because of her initial views. It didn't help. So it's not just the protest voters and the absentee voters. There are people who voted for her right now who, because she lost the election, are dropping into the comments with takes like these. And I've seen this again and again and again. People who are like, I showed up and did my part, and it didn't help. It didn't do anything. And I think these are like young voters. I think that this happens to young people or people who it's their first time trying anything ever. It's their first time ever being like, you know what? Okay, fine. I'll try. I'll get a ballot and I'll fill one out. And then it doesn't go their way. And immediately they're like, see, I did it. And it didn't work. Her losing is not proof that your vote didn't matter. She still got 75 million votes and you were one of those. She didn't get zero. She lost by like 1.5% of the popular vote. And if all of the absentee voters have shown up, she would have won. You would have been part of the winning team. You did your job. Just because it didn't work doesn't mean that your vote was meaningless. Like if she had won, your vote would have counted just as much as it did in the current situation. You would have been just as much a part of that victory as you are a part of this defeat. Don't lose faith in the entire process of voting just because it didn't go your way the one time you tried anything. You got to show up again and again and again. You got to keep doing your job. Listen, I understand that I am a loudmouth, smug, snarky motherfucker. And if you made it this far into the video, into this podcast episode, and you're a protest voter and you're a leftist who's just chomping at the bit to jump into the comments and give me an earful of whatever slogan you've got that I didn't tackle in this video, I would just implore you to please just sit with these things. Please just sit and think. Could it be that maybe I was a little misguided in my strategy? Just look around at the world we are currently in and think, did my choice help to prevent this or to ensure that this happened? Look around at the current policies that are being enacted into legislation by the current administration and ask yourself sincerely, did I do everything in my power to prevent this reality, or did I actively participate in creating this reality? And be honest about that, because we need you. We need you on our team. We need you to understand where you were in error. We need you to understand where you fucked up and how to prevent it going forward. I know I sound like an asshole, but I'm asking you sincerely, please help me. Join us in this work. There are more of us than you. I know that you want us to join you. I know that you want all of us to just be protest voters next time around. There's 75 million of us. There's like 6 or 7 million of you. Just get on board with us. We have a track record that shows that when you do that, we win, okay? We can vote that motherfucker out if you join us, but we need you. We need you to stop ducking the accountability. We need you to get honest about what your choice meant. I'm going to finish this episode by reading this amazing post. I'm going to read all of it from Joan Westenberg that I saw on Threads that I think really sums up how I feel. She just said it better than I ever could. So this is how I'm going to finish. She wrote in all caps and in quotes, "But Harris didn't earn my vote." And then she responds to that with the following. "When you frame your vote as something that must be earned through a perfect alignment of policies and promises, you're abdicating your role in the democratic process. You're pretending you're a passive consumer rather than an active participant." Here's what adults do. They make choices between real options, not imaginary ones. They understand that inaction is a choice. They recognize that abstaining is voting too. It's just letting others decide. Every few years, depending on where you live in the democratic world, you face a binary moment. Two distinct futures stretch out before you, and one or another will happen whether you participate or not. Your vote isn't a gold star you award for good behavior. It's not a merit badge or a performance review. It's a choice, your choice, about the future you want to live in. When you say, "They didn't earn my vote," you're really saying, "I choose not to choose." But that's not how responsibility works. That's not how democracy works. That's not how adulthood works. The myth of the earned vote is comfortable because it lets us off the hook. It transforms our civic duty into a consumer transaction. It turns citizenship into a spectator sport. But democracy demands more from us than just being critics. It demands that we engage with what is, not what ought to be. It requires us to make hard choices between imperfect options, because that's what adults do. And you're an adult. Act like one. People Pleaser is written, edited, hosted, and produced by me, Austin Archer, with original theme music also by me. You can find more of my music by going to austinarchermusic.bandcamp.com. Great way to support indie music and support this show. Another great way to support this show is to go to patreon.com/Austin Archer. You can find extended versions of my videos with bonus content all the time over on Patreon. Patreon often gets early content as well, early access. Shout out to all the Patreon patrons. Thank you so much for your support and for helping me continue to do this work. Your support is invaluable. Like, share, subscribe, and comment on this video to help boost my engagement in the YouTube algorithm. And we'll see you at the next one. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. And bye-bye.